we usually find high 6 to low 7-figure opportunities. And if we can allow businesses to see that value and deploy that cash to give them that visibility of what hole they need to plug to stop the leak, that's what we are here to do.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields. With me, as always, is Kellen Finney. And this week, we got a very special guest, Tyler Nielsen, founder of Vast Insights Partner. Tyler, thanks for taking the time. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Brian. Thanks for having me. Excited
to have you here. Kellen, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Really excited to talk to Tyler. Really excited to dive into kind of the nuances of like connecting the front end of the business with like operations and all the things that like kind of make it tick. And I'm grateful to kind of talk to someone in the Midwest, right?
Yeah, I'm stoked. I think there's a lot of information that we're going to take off LinkedIn and kind of dive a little deeper in. I think like the aspects of what's going on in the industry now are hard. Everyone's trying to cut costs. But I think before looking to cut, we got to understand what we're currently doing and how we can do better by having a better conversation around data and that tracking elements. And I don't think there's anyone doing it any better than Tyler. So before we dive into the fun stuff and I get excited myself, Tyler, we got a little East Coast, West Coast battle. I know you got a particular conversation there. So where would you put yourself on the map?
No, it's Third Coast. It's Fresh Coast. It's Midwest. And I don't think we're misrepresenting all the concentration of large representation on Chicago. So happy to represent the flyover states as we articulated, but no, Fresh Coast all the way.
A very powerful introduction. So for our listeners unfamiliar, can you give a quick background on how you found your way to the cannabis space?
Yeah, I've been in manufacturing majority of my career, finance operations. Had a colleague that went to college together, kept in contact since we graduated. And he calls me up one day and said, "Hey, I'm going to this new industry. You know, we're coming out of large corporations, both of us." And he goes, "I think I need you to support the growth and scaling of this organization." I never would have thought I would be having this type of conversation or be in the industry. But yeah, got into the industry through a connection. It's the most intriguing, confusing, challenging, and enjoyable industry all at the same time. And to me, it's a lot of problems that, standard large corporations are trying to solve at the same time, just with a little more agricultural spice to it. So came in probably through a non-traditional way and would probably call myself still a newcomer in the industry. I'm not a legacy person, but manufacturing through and through. And it's exciting to be part of the industry now.
Before we dive into Vast Insights Partner and some of the roles you do, I think we should define just basics, right? Get on the same page and then we can really get into the specifics. So let's define growth and then how that's different from profitability.
Yeah, so Vast Insight Partners, the firm I started to help not only cannabis companies, but also other mid-market manufacturing businesses connect financial insights all the way through to operational execution, right? So we can focus on scaling profitably, not just growing faster. So to your point, the growth engine is it's top line revenue, it's new SKUs, it's incremental cultivation, it's another state we're going into. It's a state transitioning from med to rec. All of those items, that's the growth in the scaling conversation. The growth on the top line conversation. Now, from a how do we scale profitably conversation is how do we take the forecast? How do we take the visibility to margins, the SKU profiles? Like what mix are we making and what does the state actually support with product offerings? And how do we make sure we're not just taking a sales action of, hey, I need 10,000 units a month. Okay, great. We make 10,000 units, we move on and we don't think about it. The whole idea of just connecting the front end to the back end is how do we do it in an effective manner without just piling cash into inventory, right? But doing it in a way that maintains diversity, maintains the SKU mix. We want to put good product out. So in the cannabis space, it's about fresh flower. It's about really good strains within concentrates. It's within the mix that you have in vapes and whatever the clients or customers need at the right time. So it's all about taking that. How do we top line grow? How do we grow revenue? But doing it in a way that we're conscious of costs and not just, creating and manufacturing everything that we need, but doing it in a way that we see the pull through And we're not overburdening retail stores. We're not overburdening the sales team to say, hey, go sell us. It's been sitting on the shelf for too long.
Let's unpack that, because there's a ton there. And for some of the vertically integrated operators that handle all the aspects of the supply chain, does that start with an executive up top that says, hey, here's the focus? And then how does it trickle down through an organization that each part of the supply chain handles their responsibilities, does it responsibly, and all does it within the guidelines that align with what you said, growing profitably and scaling profitably?
Yeah. It has to start with executive backing, right? If this doesn't execute well, if the leadership of the organization is not aligned with how we go execute. Now, contrary to some belief, there also has to be the bottoms up focus of saying we want to get better and allowing the operator to do exactly what they're good at. So, to me, this is the conversation around, we have this whole ambition to grow, but our execution isn't necessarily top notch, right? So we're focused on that execution gap, taking that strategy of a large player or a craft grower or an oil producer. They all know where their path is and what they want to grow. We take that and help them execute it. And when I say execute it, it's how many units do you want next month? Are we going into a 420 cycle? Are we going into a 710? Are we going into Green Wednesday? All of those is going to be a different product mix. So depending on what we are, what are we doing as a business is going to dictate how we start that, from a forecast projection, a demand plan. What is the sales team seeing, right? It's all about the connectivity of saying, we're making a plan and we're executing that plan with integration from every single person in the organization, all the way down to the sales rep, feet on the streets, that they know what they want, when they want it, and getting that alignment so we can give them the best material at the best time for whatever cycle we're in the year.
What does that initial integration process kind of look like with your firm and a business that's looking to bring this kind of insight into their decision-making process?
Yeah. It's got to start with an execution analysis, right? Where's our gaps? Where are we looking at? What are we roadblocked with or hurdled with right now, right? So are we not getting enough biomass through, right? We're projecting, and I'm just going to pick some random numbers. We're projecting 60 grams a square foot and we're only getting 20, right? That would be detrimental to a cultivation team. And I know those in the field are not going to allow that. But how are we actualizing our forecast? And where do we then adjust the mix? So it's really all about benchmarking where we are right now, and then having a true conversation around where do we want to be in the next 6, 12, 18 months? What are we trying to do? Do we want to be the best producer of high potency, high terp, high quality flower? Or do we just want to have a great assortment of vapes, distillate or rosin based, right? What is our conversation? What do we want to do? And that's really where we start the conversation, is understanding here's where we are, here's where we want to go, and what strategy do we need to go execute? And then we help fill that execution gap. And it's not just hey, we hand you a strategy deck, good luck. It's us working alongside leadership teams, building the connected processes, making sure we're not overburdening inventory, adjusting the cultivation plans with the diversities that we need as we go, and then really just focusing on the continuous cycle of that process.
So just to make sure I understand correctly, it seems like the first step is kind of like an internal audit where your team has to go through and understand all of the cogs in the wheel, speak to the players and recognize where are the gaps, because sometimes an executive might have one perspective. Hey, operator one has these challenges, but operator one may feel like he doesn't have those challenges. He's got a different one. And there's a disconnect between leadership and the team. So how granular is those details? And do you speak to all the people on the ground who are actually on the day-to-day trying to figure out how to do their job?
Like I started with, it's got to have executive backing. And we talk through, okay, the executive level probably needs some more visibility and more awareness to what's going on, whether that's dashboarding, whether that's live data feeds, whether that's just a weekly report, right? But then to your comment, it goes all the way down to the operator, the cultivator, the individuals that are actually executing the plan in the plant. There's a different need of data granularity at each level, and there's different inflection points of what is connecting the process, right? The executives might have a gap between the IT group because revenue recognition and timeliness of revenue reports or inventory reports. But the facility individual is, how much oil do I have right now and what do I need next week? So I need to start batching that to produce it. So it's the level of granularity throughout the scope. But to your point, it is an absolute audit of the process to see where we stand, and then really focusing on what are the quick wins that we can focus on right away. How can we make sure the sales team is communicating what they need? Not just number of units, but diversity, right? Potency conversations, and what's the brand look like if they have multi-brand states. So yeah, it's a very, some may call it chaotic conversation, but if we don't focus on that connected plan, right? No matter who you're talking to, the signal is based off of the same input. What is our demand plan? What is that demand plan signaling, and how many units do we need to go execute? So that the executives know this is what we're driving to, and we're confident we're going to deliver our revenue projections for the month, the quarter, and the next 12 months. And we can then plan the inventory all the way through that cycle to make sure that, again, we're not just parking cash on the balance sheet and burdening the CFO to try to explain that away. But we're also making sure that we have the quick turns and fresh product and establish the brand standards or the expectations that the customers want.
Is a lot of this kind of like interaction, like more of like a coaching basis where you're working with the executive team? You've had conversations with like every different level of technician within the organization, and then you're kind of just like coaching them through achieving these goals that they've set out? Or is it kind of more hands-on where like, hey, there's an issue with this lower level situation, and you kind of go in and try to like re-emphasize like, hey, these are the goals we're trying to reach. This is why we need you to do this. Like, kind of talk us through some of those items associated with the execution process.
Yeah. So in any organization, cannabis or not, it's not complexity that kills it. It's the confusion of what do we do next.
Yeah.
So it's making sure the teams are aware of what we're executing towards. So to answer your question directly, it's about 50% coaching and 50% hands-on execution. So there are frameworks that we've created or leveraged, not just for cannabis, but for any manufacturer around how do we do demand planning? How does that demand planning kick off supply plans? How do we forecast demand? Do we just look at what we did last year and, market says we're going to be up 3%, so we'll just add 3%. And, how do we get better accuracy on forecasting and make a robust enough process that when we're not involved in the engagement, individuals know what they need to do and the questions they need to ask, but also create curiosity around the process, right? So that's part of the coaching, but also the execution. We give frameworks, we give visibility to how we want and hope the business works when we leave an organization. But it's really about the coaching side of it is driving the curiosity to the individual of, hey, if I need 10,000 units in 2 months, what do I need to do today? I've got to get the distillate. I've got to formulate it. How do I get it all ready to go? Because if the demand changes next week and I don't know what I'm doing, I can't support that sales plan. So there's a lot of the awareness of connecting the strategy to the execution on the coaching side, but then just creating curiosity of individuals and driving them to ask the right questions. Engage with more than one. If you're in the facility and you're a cultivation leader, if you're not talking weekly to what demand changes are shifting, or you're not having discussions around weekly harvest walks on how that material we expected it to be last week and what's changed week over week and how that material flow may change and go into fin goods, that's a gap. So how do we get the framework of what questions do we ask? What data do we need? How do we benchmark it? Is a lot of the data hands-on conversation to make sure we have some idea. Because again, we're talking about a plant here. It's not going to execute as much to our expectation that we intend. And therefore that variability is a known. And we have to put a framework in place to allow for that variability down the path.
It must be such a difficult conversation to have when you're speaking to these individuals that are juggling so many different paths at the same time. Because on one side, you have to ask people for numbers. But the second, you yourself probably have to verify to ensure that the numbers that are going into this are accurate and represent the correct information, correct inputs, so that flows all the way through the system. So how do you approach those conversations in a delicate balance where you can ask them for specific information, but then you can also feel comfortable verifying that the information they provided is accurate and represents the true cogs behind it?
It's a great question. We have to be able to build trust and transparency up front that we're here to help you. There's a reason that's happening, and there was a reason we're here. And even before you get to those conversations, there's a lot of like, oh, why is this guy here? Like, he come here to take my job? And no, it's how do we partner with organizations? The reason I named the business Fast Insight Partners. We bring insights via partnerships. That's what we do. And I can't operate if you can't, or the business can't provide transparent and trusting insights to what data we're trying to talk about. So let's talk about forecasting for a second. Let's talk about whether it's revenue or demand forecasting. There's a conversation out there that people think forecasting will eliminate the uncertainty. Well, if we just forecast it, it's going to happen, right? And no, that's not forecasting. All forecasting does is make you ready for the potential uncertainty. That here's what we think is going to happen, and we consistently have conversations around market dynamic changes, mix changes, state regulation impacts. How do we forecast? It's just making sure that at least what we can control as a team is documented, and that's the number the team is going forward with. So a vape plan, SKU diversity, size diversity, flavorings potentially. How do we make sure the sales team is giving us the right input to execute all the way through to supply? Now, there's supply constraints, there's material constraints, there's, oh shoot, we forgot to order enough hardware, right? But all of this process is tied to the input. So that's what we work to correct, to really then, the data becomes clear as you go. So it's not a light switch moment. It's not like, oh, you give us all this inputs and we flip the switch and it's magically fixed, right? It's an iterative process that we focus on implementing the frameworks so that the outliers become clear. And then we can go manage those outliers as exceptions. The process still runs, right? We still execute in the background. And now we can focus on the things that keep distracting us, get those out of the way, and keep making the process more accurate as you go forward. So it starts with trust and transparency. It starts with visibility to what we're currently doing or what data we don't have. And if we don't have the data, we're going to go find it. How do we look at harvest planning? How do we look at demand planning? How do we look at capacities within a manufacturing space? We've got to dig into all those and get those on the table so that we can talk about what can we or can't we do. And then we bring those insights to the executive team and say, hey, you guys wanted to do 25,000 units of vape. Well, your manufacturing can only do 15. Here are the gaps you need to go solve. Whether it's a machine, whether it's more labor, whether it's more biomass. And then they make that decision. We're not going to be solving the world's problems, right? We're bringing the problems to light so that we can solve them and make proactive decisions.
Is there like a specific problem that kind of plagues all of these companies that you interact with?
Yes, and it's usually inventory, and it's probably broader than just stating, do we or don't we have the finished good to sell? It's sales doesn't have the diversity mix that they expect, right? So how do we make sure sales gets all the indica sativa hybrid mixes depending on what SKU we're talking about? Or there's aged inventory, and as you guys know, the longer it sits, the less valuable it gets to all of us, and the less we're willing to pay for it. As long as we can manage the inventory, we can manage the firm's cash and support the firm's cash, because the cost of capital in this industry, as you guys know, is tremendously high. So if we can turn inventory one more time per month, that's a massive cash unlock to an organization. And they can either invest that in new brands, development of state acquisitions, new material for production, right? They don't have to go and sign away their life on the cost of capital. So inventory is a lot of the times the symptom that we see within organizations. A lot of the times there's the underlying problems of teams working in silos that cause the gaps that show up in inventory. So usually we'll get the conversation around inventory and we go fix all the other pieces that we uncover during that analysis and gap audit.
So just to unpack that a little further, the inventory, let's say, is the problem. And let's say they've got 100 units of vapes and they should have only had 50. Is that based on manufacturing just producing them at a continued rate and they produce as much as they can and just kind of is a downstream effect? Or is there another element that's missing? Because what it seems like is you guys are putting together like a puzzle, and you have to figure out first, where is the biggest hole in the puzzle? And then where are the gaps in the communication so that the feedback loop can work, where the sales rep saying, hey, we need more indicas, and manufacturing is like, we are making indicas, and it's communicating in a way where it's not reactive, it's more proactive.
Yeah. So you hit a lot on a lot of little pieces there. And the conversation is, how do we get really proactive around what we intend to produce? So I like to throw around a little concept called cultivate with intent. So how do we give 6 to 8 to 12 months out visibility of the demand needed, the finished good items? And then how do we let the cultivators just go execute what they're really good at, is growing good biomass at the right potencies in rooms that are, whether indoor, greenhouse, whatever you have, and delivers in the time frame that the finished good is desired. That takes a lot more. Like I'm dramatically oversimplifying. Let's just be transparent here. But it's the right signal, right? It's how do we get the team to focus on what they're really good at? I don't think I'm answering your question though. Articulate that again, Brian.
The challenge, it seems like, is you're putting together a puzzle piece. And the cultivate with intent is a great approach because you're starting with the starting material, and it goes all the way through with inventory. But then how does the cycle loop work in unison where everything is humming, let's say at the right speed, where production is producing 10 units. So let's say 10 units a day where they need to hit 15 or 20, they can increase or they can downspeed. How do all those pieces get interconnected where it makes sense for a business where they can feel like they're growing at the right speed, but also not hindering other elements of their area?
Yeah, so we focus heavily on, let's just talk about supply execution, right? So manufacturing. What is their signal on their input, right? The supply plan says, I need 100 units. And that supply plan is factored off of what does sales need in the next couple weeks or months, how much materials in current inventory is on hand, and then how much material can we operate with, right? How much do we have coming through the pipeline for biomass? So it's not usually a binary conversation where sales didn't sell or manufacturing didn't produce enough or they produced too much, right? It's this balance of making sure your inventory is within a reasonable window of supply, right? So what we usually focus on is that 100 units, like we keep referring to. Let's just say that equates to 30 days of finished good material, right? So we might have a plus or minus 10 days on that window, right? We can have inventory anywhere from 20 days of supply to 40 days of supply. As long as we're within that window, hitting the potency targets, hitting the diversity targets, we're okay, as long as we've gotten agreement from the executive team. And really, it's making sure that we have that plus or minus window and we're comfortable with the impacts that it has on how much material is coming down, how much inventory is on the balance sheet, because you know you're going to over or underproduce. It's manufacturing. The plan never goes as expected. Same thing with sales. We never sell the exact amount of ACE that we expected because some other wholesaler might have sold in some really good product the previous week, or it was 420 and we got a bigger pull through than we expected and we couldn't react to it in time because our capacity. All of those factors come into play. So inventory is the biggest problem, but it's also the biggest opportunity of making sure we balance it properly. To say the variability within that demand is really managed by the inventory that we have so that we know from a supply capacity or a sales perspective what lever we can pull. And in some instances, when you get up the maturity scale and you're executing the process more effectively, the supply team can go to the sales team and say, hey, 6 weeks from now, we've got this material coming down. What do you guys want to do with it? Do we want to put it here? Do we want to put it there? Do you want to have a promo here? And that's really when you start to see the value of the process, as long as each respective function is accountable for their step and the data in is feeding the next downstream action.
So what's your kind of rule of thumb? Because a lot of this sounds like just internal POs, right? Like the manufacturing side's like, hey, here's a menu of the 10 strains that we're going to be making these next 12 weeks. You guys pick what you want to do with it as a sales team. If it wants to go to vape for these strains because they're popular. So there's also this dynamic that occurs within that communication chain, right? You say you have a lead grower. he has KPIs that he's trying to hit from a yield perspective. He knows if he grows only OG that he'll hit his KPIs. The sales team, they have KPIs. They go, hey, I'm not going to sell any fucking OG. Excuse my language, sorry. But like, I'm not going to sell any OG. Why are we growing OG? So like, where does that, like, how do you balance that from a rule of thumb perspective in terms of like manufacturing, hitting optimal yields in terms of like hitting the 60 grams per square foot that they know they can do, but also balancing the fact that like strains sell sometimes, they don't other times. And that whole industry is super volatile from a marketing perspective.
Yeah. So if the KPIs are not aligned, it's not going to work. Right. So totally 60 grams per square foot. Yeah, we'll hit that. But there's got to be a diversity mix KPI against that. There's got to be how much material, right? You could have 60 grams a square foot, but that's, we have we're only getting 6,000 grams out of a room, or are we getting 600,000 grams out of a room, right? So the size, the capacity, and then connected execution. So the KPI cannot be a siloed KPI within any respective function. So the grams per square foot conversation of 60, that sounds great. But does it then articulate to what fin goods I need when that material is through to that process? So if I'm saying 60 grams a square foot is a target for them on the cultivation side, but I'm saying I need 80 grams per square foot to actually hit my fin good numbers based on the square footage I have, then we're not aligned. And what we do with this process and the connectivity of the execution is bringing that up before it gets to that point. Before the plants even go into the ground, what's the historical analysis on this strain or this room? We've had, a strain might perform well in one room, might not perform well in another room because of the environmentals, right? But that's for the cultivator to be the expert in. We then take their estimates, and that's where we have harvest comparisons and data analytics to help us identify, are we over or under forecasting, but calling that out before we even get to that harvest of that material. So we have that variability built in and we can make the decisions, but this is where it's not going to articulate as we expect. So there has to be some variability built into that so that we can adjust. And that's material in process, right? So if we're continually hand to mouth and material, we can't be ready for that variable. So it's making sure that we're processing the right way and connecting all of those processes to make sure we can give the signal early so we know what risk or what decision risk we're willing to take and what we're willing to live with downstream before it actually gets to that. It's all proactive decision making.
The KPIs is such an interesting dilemma when you have an interconnected supply chain like this. We've got a vertically integrated company. If they're not aligned and they're not all swimming in the right direction, they're kind of counterintuitive. So for example, if the inventory is like, the sales team's like, we need vape units now. Manufacturing's like, we're going to turn these over as fast as we can. Maybe quality suffers, maybe efficiency suffers. And because of that, the COGS are different. So tracking all those elements becomes even more complex and more difficult because if your COGS are kind of getting inflated, meaning your costs are going higher, now the margin profile in that step is being decreased. So then, yeah, sure, maybe you're selling more units in a faster turnaround. But if you're not making enough of that, this is where the growth versus profitability becomes such a challenge.
Yeah, you're spot on. And it's, we haven't talked much about the financial side of it, but you have to have a financial, integration to that whole process too, right? I like to talk about having finance, sales, and operations tied together. Those are the broad categories, but you've got to have your costing dialed in. You have to know whether you're doing average weighted costing or month-to-month costing. You've got to know what your sales team is incentivized on. There's another KPI. How does your sales team get comped? Are they dealing with, mixed numbers? Are they dealing with just sales revenue targets? How's your operations team incentivized? How do they go and execute what targets do they want? Is it how much biomass we get out of our facility, or do we hit revenue targets, right? So we're talking really back of office or operational sided KPIs on the execution of it. But let's zoom out even a further perspective and talk about the KPIs of how we track the business performance from at the end of the day, we're all selfish, right? I want to make money. You want to make money. I'm here to help you make more money. That's what my business does. And if I'm not incented to help you do that, then we're both on a different path. but that's all the way through the organization too. So it is in manufacturing, it's articulated as integrated business planning, right? That's the concept. It's sales and ops planning, sales inventory and ops planning. There's multiple different ways to articulate the process we're mentioning here. But if it's not all the way through, all KPIs, all metrics, how do we grade the business? It's not allowing, as you articulated earlier, Brian, it's not allowing for those feedback loops to occur. The worst thing we see is when we go into a business and they say, yeah, we have an end-to-end process. And it's like, okay, how do you take this end? How do you take this end? And how do you tie them together? Right? How do we create that feedback loop? And that's a lot of the conversation we see in that audit up front. It's just this person talking to that person, and it would solve half of our issues. And now it's creating the process so that it's not necessarily people having to say, press a button, but it's somebody doing their normal cycle of their forecast. It's talking about production. It's having the people in place. How many people do I need in 3 months to produce? If we're growing and we're going up to the right, do I need more people? How do I trigger HR to go hire? Right? All of this is articulated through this process. It is an integrated business plan that starts with the strategy and ends with the finished good execution. But all of it's tied together.
That's where those numbers, though, can be so, let's call them creative in the way they're reported or communicated throughout the organization, because you can hit certain KPIs, but if they're not accurately describing, let's call it the health of the business, and for the manufacturing standpoint, we'll stay there. It's like, if you're not communicating what all your actual costs are, your margins then are being misrepresented, which means then when the money's coming through the chain, you're kind of like, hey, we sold X, we made Y, that's the difference, that's our profitability. But there could be other elements there that are hidden and causing other downstream effects. Do you see that as like a leak in a business? And how bad could those leaks be, where a company who, let's be honest, there's a million things going on in these organizations. How do these companies then prioritize fixing these problems given the speed of the industry and how they're juggling so many different things just to survive?
So that's even a more impactful statement right now with what we're dealing with tariffs coming off of Chinese New Year and the orders that had to be put in for hardware, the end of November, early December last year, right? Nobody can predict how a plant's going to grow, and nobody's going to predict how this administration is going to change the landscape of business and cannabis in general. Because of the cost of capital within this space, we have to focus on cash. We have to focus on cash, and we have to stay close to what customers want. And to do that, we have to build this repeatable habit of execution so that we can focus on taking the strategy, executing the strategy, seeing the cash come in, and then making the right next step, how we execute on that cash. Where do we want to deploy it? And if we're not staying close to our customers and we're not focused on cash, it's not going to be beneficial. And we need to make sure we find, how do we say no to the wrong opportunities faster so that we make the next right decision? We're not going to make all the right decisions, but was it a good decision or a bad decision is the outcome, not the decision. We need to make sure we disconnect those. But starting with cash, staying close to customers, and building this repeatable execution, that to me it's a risky business. It's a risky environment to be in. Things are happening week to week, day to day. And we're all seeing that. But cash is king or queen, depending on who you are at the top of the business. And we've got to keep a focus on that.
How do you prioritize the deployment of that cash in terms of, hey, we could spend the cash on X that increases our revenue, or we could deploy the cash for Y that helps with our budget and our costs and like decreases our monthly burn, right? Like, how do you help businesses kind of navigate that landscape?
Yeah, it's a great question, and really ties back into when we look at long-term execution plans, right? So a budget is a point in time that we want to go hit, right? When we're looking at that, how do we translate the unit or the revenues into units? We know there's going to be price compression, so how do we bake that in? And we translate that all the way through the process to say, we need to be able to make X amount of units, and here's the timeline. Well, based on that budget and based on that planning, the better our team or our process is integrated into that conversation, the more highlights we can say, hey, red flag Q3, we've got a capacity gap, right? You guys don't have a Thompson Duke capacity, or you have a Thompson Duke capacity issue here. You need another one of these machines, or you need 5 more people, or you need to operate a second shift, or whatever you need. But it allows us to raise those flags and say, here's a mismatch in demand versus supply. or here's a mismatch on capacity that we then need to figure out, where do we deploy that cash? Where do we focus on it? How do we know we need more biomass? Well, based on our long range plan and your estimates, the cultivation estimates, we have a mismatch. Where is it? Is it on potency? Do we need really good indoor environmentals and therefore we just focus on really high potency flower? Or do we just need more biomass to put it in food grade distillate? Having those conversations and making sure that strategy is all aligned allows us to do capital planning, allows us to do people planning, and really allows us to execute that strategy, which goes all the way to the beginning of the discussion around, if we can't identify where we want to be in 6 to 12 months, then we're already behind the 8 ball.
Seems like tools that allow for visibility throughout the process can be paramount now in order to remove those gaps in the process. Because it's one thing to have a plan, and then the true reality is there's human beings handling various elements. And if you don't have tools to provide for visibility across the supply chain, you have the opportunity to fail back into the other process, what you're doing, which could cause, again, turmoil and more challenges, which then is just a repeated cycle. So the tools of the visibility, does your team help deploy those tools? How else do you help in those elements?
Yes, for sure. We focus on people and process first. That has to be foundational, because if you don't have the right people in the right spot, or you're missing people within business, any process isn't going to execute. Now, similarly, if we don't have a process in place, the person can be a dynamite. But if a process isn't in place, they're just going to be spinning their wheels. So that is the majority of our focus, on identifying the people and processes that we need to either adjust, improve, or change. Providing frameworks and allowing that framework to help that people and process move forward. On a maturity level, that's step 1 and 2. We want to get to step 10. You're talking about, all the keywords right now of, AI tools and, all these IT, like those are the solutions for down the path. But if we don't have the people and process on the early maturity scale, we're not going to get past that. It is the execution gap of strategy, taking our strategy to execution, and then making sure the cross-functional alignment occurs. So we'll put very early frameworks in place around visibility tools, age of finished good material, days of supply on the material on hand. How long is our whip process? So how long does it take me to dry versus what I expected it to take to dry? How long is my grow cycle, right? All of the KPIs that are all connected, we give early visibility to that. And usually, again, it's just math, right? I hate to say it that way, but it's just math of here's what our expectation was, here's what we did, and then tracking those through the process and connecting them all. So that's where we start. And eventually, as you go up that maturity scale, you can talk through all the fun, data warehousing tools or data visualization tools, whether it's Tableau or Power BI or, some AI forecasting tools. But if we don't focus on that people process up front, we can't get to that point. And usually we find ourselves focusing on that people process first, building frameworks so that it can be an automated tool in the future, and then giving scope and visibility to how we can help build that or support that as businesses progress on that maturity scale.
I would assume, Tyler, when you're having conversations with these operators, they're telling you, Tyler, there's a million things going on. Cash is super strapped. Do I have a problem? Maybe. Why is it worth me spending my time and my effort and the changes that come with knowing this? Why is it worth investing with your team?
Yeah, so when we start out and do that audit, the execution gap analysis, we're going to give you a dollar figure that says, here's an estimate of what you're leaving on the table. Now, 99% of the time, it's going to be much larger than that, but we're being very conservative with fact-based conversations around units, costing, how much people are working on your business right now, what's your current cost of capital. And we can give you a pretty good scenario around how much money you're leaving on the table by not executing, these pillars, right? If I cannot articulate a 5 times ROI on engaging with my team, me and my team, it's not worth my time or your time. And that's where the cash flow really is important, because we're going to help unlock it, increase your revenue, improve your margins. And at the end of the day, we want people to do more value add work. I don't need somebody taking a number from one spreadsheet and plugging it into another spreadsheet. That's not going to be helpful. but having the data
Keeps them busy.
translate. Say that again.
I said it keeps them busy. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah, it does, but
That's the way we've always done it, Tyler.
that's the way we've always done it. The teams I've been a part of will chuckle at this if they listen to this. If I can get a monkey to do it, it's not worth our time, right? If we can get somebody to just, I can train my 4-year-old to type in a number. Look at this one, type it in over here. Look, right? That's not value add. So we need to do less value add, more human-based analytic curiosity, connecting all that insight. That's the value. And if it's not a 5 times ROI on what we're going to return, it's not worth it to anybody. So we look at improving revenue, increasing margin, reducing the complexity, but then also looking at the proactive decisions, right? When am I out of canopy space? When do I need more canopy space? Or when do I need better environmentals because I'm not getting the material I need? When do I need to hire 5 more operators? When do I need a new machine? That takes a long-term vision, but we execute that process to give you short-term actions to get quick wins and then give you that longer-term visibility so we make the right decisions on how we deploy cash.
Is there parts in the conversation where, let's say, you've done the audit, you've recognized the plan, you've laid out potential improvements, and you're speaking to the manager and you're like, okay, this is where we need to make adjustments here. This entry-level operator or employee, we need them to do this step instead of this step. And the manager's like, listen, can't get them to do that. They do what they do and it is what it is. Do you have those conversations?
Every once in a while, not too often. The business, in any manufacturing space, you want standard operating procedures, right? And if we can guide and help correct that, that's a win. But that's not anything we dramatically focus on. That facility leader, the facility manager, director, whatever they're called, whether it's a craft grower or an oil producer or a fully vertically integrated business, we're all going to have hiccups like that where we're going to have the human aspect of business come into play. And while I'd love to say I can help solve that, we zoom out a little further to say, here's what we need to deliver. However we get that, I can help get visibility to where our gaps are, but I can't correct it, right? I can lead a man to water, but I can't force him to drink, right? I can give them the guidance and give them the questions to ask, the data to execute on, and give them the awareness of how we'd get better. And that's really where the whole humanistic approach within a facility becomes much more complex than just saying I need 5 units.
Is that where it kind of turns into like a coaching role for you where you're like, hey, this is how you guys want to kind of form this culture. This is an issue now. And you kind of just go up higher in terms of communicating with a higher level representative at that point?
Yeah. Again, if I don't have executive buy-in, this process doesn't work.
Yeah.
Whether it's me supporting it or the organization when I depart with my team. Trust and transparency. We've said it before. I ask to have every other week or every week conversations with the executive sponsor of an engagement I have, because I want to give visibility. I want to keep them on pace because we move quick, because it's not just, this week we'll look at some data and we'll tell you what we should do. No, we're talking deep dive, deeper conversations, executing frameworks, getting calendarized processes in place. And week to week, there's a lot to do and a lot to connect. As Brian articulated before, there's a lot of puzzle pieces we're trying to put together at the same time. And we're not talking your Mickey Mouse 10-piece puzzle here, right? This is a 1,000-piece puzzle and the image is literally just blue. So it's a complex situation, but that's where the humanistic side, the coaching, the leadership, understanding, in some instances that person may just be annoyed that day and maybe it's just not the day to talk to them. But that's where part of my engagement, getting on site, getting visible to the facility, seeing the complexities they're dealing with. I mean, 1, it's just a fascinating industry to be in. But 2, at the end of the day, we're manufacturing a product. There are variables that we can and cannot predict. And it's how do we respond to those variables that really matters.
I love the fact that you have the weekly engagements, right? Because it's one thing for you to provide all the information, but if you don't have the executive team's ear and attention, then it's so easy for it to slide back to the normal route. And you're not able then to implement all these intuitive changes, because you're right. You can provide the greatest plan in the whole world and detail every little problem that they have. But if they're not there with you saying, okay, here's the problem, we can solve this. Here's the problem, we solve this. Let me talk to my team. There becomes that misalignment. So We talked about inventory as a major problem. Is there two other ones, just to give our listeners a grasp of where else can they consider potential issues that they need to look inwards on?
Yeah, the continuity between teams is usually another large issue. How do we get cross-functional engagement, to use corporate speak, right? How do we get the teams talking the same language, working together? That's usually that's a little more coaching conversations than it is data and execution on frameworks. That usually comes up with a little bit of a culture conversation. You might uncover that up front. It's about culture, but then it's about visibility, right? So how do we get the people in sales to understand the process gaps or opportunities within operations and vice versa? Right? I don't need a salesperson being an expert on how we operate the machinery or get distillate to a finished good. But the more they are aware, the better we're going to be. And the more awareness they have to the complexities and the changes and the cycle of changes that we can get visibility to.
Is that like a Slack channel or like a WhatsApp kind of group chat? Like, is that how you kind of start that whole thing? Or like,
yeah, it's usually some type of transparent communication, whether it's Teams or Slack or just text messaging or phone calls. But then it's also building a repeatable process to say, hey, Mondays at 2:00 in the afternoon, we bring all of the situations that occurred last week and the things we're dealing with today to the table. Let's get it all on the table. Let's talk about it. Where are we hitting? Where are we missing? What gaps do we have to solve now? Is there a commercial data gap? Is there do we oversell last week and we need to make an adjustment to the production plan this week? Again, it's setting the framework and saying, here's what I need to shoot for, but then allowing that conversation to adjust over time, because again, sales might oversell or undersell. Production might miss something. A machine's going to break down. A person called off. There's going to be that variable. So that's where you have to have transparent communication and you have to have visibility to the issues we're dealing with. So that's where trust and transparency comes to light. And we have to get the issues on the table to talk through them. So inventories, like we said, it's the symptom of the process. We know there's a problem. We got to dig in here. Cross-functional visibility, another big issue. But it's really just about, it's alignment, right? It's alignment to, here's what we said we're going to do. Here's how we did. We grade ourselves and we adjust on going forward.
I'd imagine there's some listeners out there, smaller organizations aspiring to be way bigger and saying, hey, Tyler, like what you're saying sounds amazing. I'm not sure if it helps me because of the size of me. Do you work with smaller teams? And is there like just a rough framework so someone who's listening has a better understanding of like the type of services, say, okay, even if you're doing, let's say 100,000 a month, like your services still could apply and it's worth considering?
Yeah. So we focus on two pillars for the organization. One is that execution gap analysis. It's the focus of how can we show you what you're leaving on the table and how can we give you some quick wins? Whether that's, we can usually provide that in about a week or two based on the interviews and the conversation. So
is there a cost, that just a ballpark cost, or you're not comfortable sharing that?
Just the three of us. That's usually around 75.
I didn't say that this time because you think about it, it's like people are going to be in their minds. They're going to be like, it's going to cost $200,000 to have Tyler do this, or it could cost $2,000, right? There's no normal range for this. So I didn't know if there was like a ballpark depending on like X to Y.
2-week gap analysis based on the time spent is going to be around $10,000. So we'll give you visibility to what you're leaving on the table. Opportunities will give you a little bit of an execution scope of, you could unlock X, Y, or Z. And then we usually try to position it that's either going to lead into an engagement to do a very early maturity scale or long-term maturity, right? Standing up an integrated business planning process, it's a long cycle. It can be a couple years. But what we focus on is doing it quicker, more cost effectively, and we're the ones doing it, right? We're the ones sitting by your side doing it with you. I'm not hiring any junior consultants. I'm not hiring any people that haven't been in the cannabis space. I am hiring people that have done it, been there, and either have built it with me or I've seen build it in other instances. And that's the value we bring. But it's that execution gap and audit up front to say, here's what you're leaving on the table. And honestly, like we mentioned, if it's not a 5 times ROI, it's not going to be worth us to engage long term. But we know the actions that we can help you with on a month-to-month or a week-to-week basis, and we'll give you that visibility. And unfortunately, it usually becomes it depends what long-term looks like. We could engage for 3 months, and we're going to give, increase your margins and increase your revenues. We can engage for 6 months, and it might just be a more in-depth process to that, right? So we really have to figure out where that potential client or where that business sits and what their desires are. Again, going back to the strategy of here's where you are, where do you want to be? So re-articulating your comment, Brian, it's the execution gap audit, which is a quick win, short-term visibility of here's what you have an opportunity to go get. And then it's a long-term strategy of how can we help you go execute that within usually a 3 to 6 month engagement, depending on the scale of the business or the complexity of the business. If it's a vertically integrated organization, it's usually going to be 6-ish months plus. If it's a smaller, craft grower, oil producer, brand business that just does contract manufacturing, those can be a little shorter because the signaling and the respective ownership of that process is less.
I think the audit, though, is so fairly priced because you get visibility into how your performance is, right? And if you have a leak that maybe you know about, but you're not sure how bad it is because you tell yourself, hey, I'll get to it when I get to it. And then your team comes in and runs some numbers. You recognize, okay, well, if we fix this problem, then the next month we don't have this problem. And it kind of compounds really, really quickly down the thing. And that's where I think people need to stop looking at cash, something I need to preserve, and start figuring out how I can plug the holes in my house to figure out how to stop the water from coming in so I don't have to keep putting duct tape up every day, because that's very expensive and it's causing worse damage long term, because you're seeing strong companies investing in fortifying their operations and recognizing where those gaps and visibilities are. And you have other companies who are like, we're doing good, we'll just keep growing and that'll surpass our problems, which, as we all know, will never be the right answer.
Yeah. And we usually find high 6 to low 7-figure opportunities, which is where, again, I'm safe with saying a 5 times ROI because it's usually closer to 10. And if we can allow businesses to see that value and deploy that cash to give them that visibility of what hole they need to plug to stop the leak, that's what we are here to do. We thrive in that type of chaos because we know that it's a challenge, and executives and the leaders that are making decisions are getting a lot of what fire do I need to fight now? And we attempt to take that issue off the table to give them actionable insights, proactive decision awareness, so that we can help get them to where they want to be faster via the execution.
I love it. I think it's perfect. So Tyler, for our listeners, they want to get in touch and they want to learn more. Where can they find you?
Yeah, usually I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Like to be out on that space. One, just to keep thought leadership going. Two, just to have a awareness to the market. Read, obviously, everything that goes out there, and people have questions. They can shoot me a message there. They can reach us at our website at vastinsightpartners.com. There's a contact page up in the upper right-hand corner. Or frankly, just email me, Tyler at vastinsightpartners.com. It's not an AI robotic inbox. It's not
not yet.
Not yet. It's not a monkey doing the inbox. It's me behind the screen. So I love having conversations and understanding what's going on in the industry, and frankly, how we can keep top of mind with organizations to help them improve, scale, and grow profitably.
I love it. We'll link it up in the show notes. Thanks for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, guys.